Money FM 89.3, the best of the afternoon update.
This is Industry Insight on Money FM 89.3, where we dive into the trends shaping business and finance today. Now, fraud is evolving, and it's no longer just about stolen IDs or simple scams. One example making headlines recently is Grey Nickel, a highly coordinated AI-driven fraud syndicate targeting banks and fintechs across Asia, using deepfakes and synthetic identities to open accounts and move money undetected. It's part of a broader trend of sophisticated, fabricated personas slipping through outdated checks and exposing financial institutions to serious risk. In fact, studies show synthetic identity fraud in Asia Pacific surged by as much as 184 to 233% last year. Wow. Here in Singapore, with our fast-growing digital banking landscape, this means banks are increasingly at risk of onboarding customers who don't even exist. So what exactly are synthetic identities? Why are they growing so fast? And how can banks in Singapore and across Asia close the gap before it's too late? Joining me to break it all down is Reinhard Hochrieser, Senior Vice President of Product and Technology at Jumio, a global leader in AI-driven identity verification. Reinhard, great to have you here.
Thank you, Lynn, for having me.
Now, let's start with what I just mentioned, groups like Grey Nickel and this sharp rise in synthetic identity fraud across Asia Pacific. How do you define synthetic identity fraud, and why is it so hard to catch?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Because meanwhile, synthetic identity fraud is a real global threat. And especially in well-developed countries like Singapore, where digital transactions and trusted digital financial systems are so central to everyone's daily lives, we need to be extra careful about those new forms of fraud. And when you think about synthetic identity fraud, so instead of stealing a real person's identity, so if I would take your national ID or a passport, which is what we often think about, identity theft, fraudsters or criminals create a completely new fake identity. So they are like tailors, modern tailors, stitching together a patchwork of real and fake information. So they might use your real NRIC number, for instance, but pair it with fictitious name, made-up date of birth, and fake addresses. And this new synthetic identity does not belong to a single living person. And they are utilizing Gen AI and deepfake technologies, which are now publicly available, to create those fake identities, right? By using those technologies, they can fake your selfies, they can fake your biometrics, but they can also create kind of images of a real passport or a real national ID card. And this is the definition of synthetic fraud. And on top, they use that new identities to build a legitimate credit history. So they might start with opening, a few small accounts, like for credit cards, and then make digital payments. And this is what we call credit washing. And this is why it's so hard to detect, right? Because it's a slow process trying to establish a real and genuine credit score.
Okay, I suppose that explains why groups like Grey Nickel can pull this off at scale. Banks are essentially serving customers that don't even exist.
Yeah.
Okay, so how do they build this credit history and then bust out by maxing out credit or moving large sums before disappearing? How do they do that?
Yeah, so let's start by looking into the verification systems themselves, like banks or financial organizations are trying to catch those fake identities. So typically the systems which are employed right now are very good at flagging real person stolen, let's say, passport and or NRIC. Synthetic identity, as I said before, doesn't belong to anyone. That's so right. It's not in an existing database. It looks like a brand new legitimate customer. And the usual red flags that you would be triggered by a stolen identity are simply not there. And the credit washing I was talking before makes it incredibly or more difficult to spot these, because the criminals are typically not Russian. So they are making small on-time payments, and to a financial institution, they look like a real and genuine customer. And over time, they are then trying to leverage that by taking, larger sums out or applying for a loan, right?
Okay, so you mentioned earlier that this is becoming a global problem. We've seen synthetic identity fraud take off in the US over the last few years. Why are we seeing such a big spike now in Asia and here in Singapore as well?
Yeah, that's a really great question. It's because the technology like AI is rapidly advancing. And let me give you a few examples around Singapore. You might remember, or the audience might remember, the largest money laundering case in 23 in Singapore, totaling in 3 billion Singapore dollars loss, right? 9 financial institutions were handed more than 27 million in penalties by the Money Authority of Singapore. And just recently, a new study came out where Singapore executives highlighted the increasing threat around cybersecurity and the use of AI being one of the top factors fueling financial crime, right? And in 24, so just a couple of months ago, the Singapore government identified in its money laundering risk assessment that the local banking sector, including, wealth management, pose the highest money laundering risk in the country. And you could actually replicate those reports or media studies to US, to Europe, because it happens everywhere. And many of those crimes are possible through the use of Gen AI. And you might remember your Singapore Minister Lee Hsien Loong, in 24, he was victim to 2 deepfake videos of himself. And the quality of those fakes are incredible. Even the mouth movements, were in sync with the fake audio. And that's the real problem we see across the globe, because nowadays it is almost impossible to distinguish a deep fake from reality. And last but not least, Jumio has done a study with consumers, and almost 75% of Singapore consumers are very concerned about their identities being used in AI-powered fraud, because it's so easy, right? You just need to take someone's face from Instagram or Facebook and use Gen AI to create a deepfake.
Okay, in some ways, our own push to go digital probably created all these gaps that criminals are exploiting. Now, you mentioned that with fraud, it can be replicated back to what's happening in the US as well. So where are banks falling short? Are we still focused very much on traditional forms of fraud? What's happening here?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And banks and financial institutions, there is way more they have to do to defend those very sophisticated frauds. So when we think about KYC, so know your customer, or CDD, customer due diligence, quite a lot of institutions are still relying on or carrying out the so-called static point-in-time approach. So that means when a consumer or even a criminal is opening, a bank account, for example, they only look into that individual once at the point in time when the account creation is happening. And they also typically only rely on the ID. So they are carrying out verification of the NRIC or a passport. So fraudsters are now moving towards, as I mentioned before, the sophisticated Gen AI attacks to create realistic but fake documents and digital identities that can fool those systems, which are very static and just a point-in-time approach. So that means banks and other organizations really need to rethink their approach and tactics, right? picking the right set of technologies, look into, a more multimodal biometric-based identity verification approach to unlock the full suite of online identity verification solutions, and also embrace a layered approach depending on the risk.
Okay, sounds like banks need to continuously monitor identity risk even after onboarding. So what are some practical steps banks here can take to close this gap?
There are a number of things, but let me try to break that down in an easy way. So Jumio's answer to that problem is identity intelligence. So that means we are combining biometric analysis. So we are taking the user's biometrics into consideration. We are leveraging real-time risk signals, like from the device, from kind of the device sensor data. We are analyzing the video stream, which is coming from the device or from the computer the person is using. And we are also tapping into cross-customer data. That's critical too, right? Understand if we have seen that person before, so to stop those most advanced attacks. So in short, smart, more adaptive, and context-driven, right? As we discussed before, relying on just inspection of an ID like a passport is not enough anymore, right? So performing a sophisticated and certified liveness check, for instance, is very critical. But by keeping in mind that the friction needs to be kept at a minimum. So we are not forcing users to nod their head or, move their head or say something. Just look into the camera like taking a selfie with your friends and family is enough, right? But the Jumio solution is capable to detect the most sophisticated presentation attacks, like using a 3D mask. And I'm pretty sure you have heard about and you've seen the Mission Impossible Tom Cruise masks. Those are real things, meanwhile. This is happening in reality. And banks and financial institutions need to use solutions being able to detect those, but also deepfakes, artificially created videos.
Wow.
I was talking about context before as well, right? We need to understand the user's behavior. So taking the device into consideration. So how often did we see that device before? Was the user associated with other devices, or have we seen some of the personal data with other IP addresses, or how old is the email address? So there are multiple different layers and signals which can be taken into consideration. And on top, here at Jumio, we are the biggest company leveraging an identity database based on millions of individuals. So we can create linkages using top-notch graph technologies to understand, the risk of individual users. So it's really about this continuous monitoring.
Okay. Reinhard, we're running out of time. So looking ahead, how do you see synthetic identity fraud evolving in this region?
Similar to all the other regions globally. So if we just take deepfake attacks, we see a 3-digit growth every year. So just within our system from 24 to 25, so this year, we have seen an almost 250% growth of deepfake attacks. And from our perspective, this will continue with the same or even a faster pace because the AI technology is becoming easily accessible for everyone. And you can create deepfakes, you can create synthetic IDs within minutes, meanwhile. And this is the biggest concern for me and for, I would say, the entire industry.
Wow, I think it's very critical if banks here want to stay ahead of these increasingly coordinated and tech-savvy fraud syndicates. They really have to rethink how they build trust in a digital-first world. All right, Reinhard, thank you so much for sharing these insights. Very concerning, but a very important topic. We've been speaking with Reinhard Hochrieser, Senior Vice President of Product and Technology at Jumio, about why synthetic identities are the new face of fraud and how banks can strengthen their defenses. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lynn.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.